Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm happy to be able to participate in this symposium. And I'm going to talk about the ability of the traditional risk factors to identify those at high risk. I'm not going to talk about imaging. I think the next presentations will tell you about the ability of carotid ultrasound of the carotid artery and coronary calcification to detect people at high risk. In the Atlas of Heart Disease and Stroke, we can find milestones in knowledge of heart and vascular disorders. And Framingham's risk factor concept is one of the major milestones. In 1961, Framingham Heart Study investigators coined the term risk factors for the development of coronary heart disease: high cholesterol level, blood pressure, and electrocardiogram abnormalities found to increase the risk of coronary heart disease. And I want to point out from the very beginning that causal risk factors are very important as therapeutic targets. This paper, published a few years ago, evaluated 3 prospective cohort studies and found that more than 87% of all that developed a fatal heart attack had at least one major risk factors. So major risk factors account for coronary heart disease. And we have the INTERHEART studies. It's a worldwide case control study of myocardial infarction that identified 9 modifiable risk factors that accounted for 90% of myocardial infarction in men and 94% in women. So, causal risk factors are important for the development of coronary heart disease. But the question is, how good are these risk factors as predictors for heart attack? Can we use them to find the people that need treatment to prevent heart attack? Going back to this paper by Greenland, showing that at least that 87% of all that developed fatal heart disease had at least one major risk factor. This paper was followed by a letter in JAMA by Weisler that pointed out, in fact, that this risk factor has remarkable low predictive power because many individuals with no coronary heart disease event also have one or more risk factors. So it's misleading to give the impression that these risk factors are useful to find those that need treatment. Let's first evaluate the individual risk factors and their ability to predict risk. How does they work? We know there is a strong and continuous relationship without any threshold between serum cholesterol level and the risk of dying of coronary heart disease. Nevertheless, 60% of all coronary heart disease events occur in the 75% of the population with the lowest cholesterol level. Randomized trials has shown that cholesterol is an important causal factor, so we need to treat high cholesterol level. But cholesterol is not a very powerful predictor. It has also been shown in the Framingham Heart Study, where we can show the relative distribution of cholesterol level in those without coronary heart disease and those that died of coronary heart disease. And we can see the discrimination for cholesterol is not good. We can identify a small population with high cholesterol level and high risk, and a population with very low cholesterol level and low risk. But there is 80% of overlap in cholesterol level between those that do not develop heart disease and those that develop heart disease. So in these 80% of the population, you can as well flip the coin. What about apolipoprotein? It was studied many years ago and published in the paper in Lancet by Wald and Law. They studied 21,520 men aged 25 to 64 years of age. And here you can see a similar distribution in England in serum cholesterol level between those that developed fatal ischemic heart disease and those that did not develop fatal ischemic heart disease. There's huge overlap. And in fact, the apolipoprotein level was not better to discriminate between these two populations. And with AIDS, it's become even worse, as also pointed out in the ATP3 guideline, where it is stated that serum cholesterol is less robust as a predictor for coronary heart disease event in the elderly. And it is in fact suggested that measurement of subclinical atherosclerosis are more promising, such as measuring the ankle brachial blood pressure index, measures for myocardial ischemia, carotid artery thickening, or coronary artery calcification, is stated in this report. It was cholesterol. What about blood pressure? Here we have a meta-analysis of individual data for 1 million adults from 61 prospective studies. And it shows what we know. There is a strong, continuous relationship between blood pressure, both systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure, and ischemic heart disease mortality. The risk increased with age, but for each age interval, there is an increased risk with increasing blood pressure. And we know from randomized trial that it's an important causal factor. If you have high risk and you lower the blood pressure, your risk becomes lower. And this strong continuous relationship not only exists by coronary heart disease, but also for stroke mortality. So hypertension or elevated blood pressure is an important risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Nevertheless, again, it's a poor discriminator between those that are at risk of developing heart disease and those that are not at risk of developing heart disease, showing here by the relative distribution, and we can see there's huge overlap between these two populations. Measuring blood pressure are not good to find those that need treatment. You could as well flip the coin. What about CRP? We know that Paul Ridker has done a lot of amazing studies in this area, and he has also assessed CRP as what he calls a predictor for coronary heart disease. And what he usually has reported until recently was a relative risk associated with high CRP level. And there is a lot of prospective epidemiological studies showing here that have shown that at a high CRP level are associated with a higher risk for coronary heart disease than a low level, with a relative risk of approximately around 2 or 3. And we can see there is a strong continuous relationship and association between CRP and the relatively risk. But how good are relatively risk as a marker for the risk, in fact, for developing the disease as a predictor? And it was published and has been published in recent years how to assess a marker's ability to predict. And in this paper it was clearly evaluated and stated the limitations of the odds ratio or hazard ratios or relative risk engaging the performance of a diagnostic or prognostic or screening marker. A marker with an odds ratio of as high as 3, as for example CRP, is in fact a very poor classification tool. And appropriate statistical methods for assessing and reporting the classification power of a marker are described. And I will come back to it later, what kind of statistical methods should be used to assess the predictive ability of a marker. This paper was also published recently, The Future of Coronary Heart Disease Prevention, and in this paper, in fact, it was stated first, it has been assumed that an important cause of coronary heart disease must be a useful screening test for coronary heart disease, but it's not true. And a relative risk of about 100, comparing those in the top and bottom fifths of the risk factor distribution, would be needed to be able to separate those at risk and those not at risk. And those for serum cholesterol and blood pressure are no more than 5, and for CRP, 3 or 4. So it's come down to statistics and the way of assessing risk factors. In fact, they are important causative factors, but they are not good predictors. And this study, they try to evaluate CRP in the way a predictor should be evaluated by assessing discrimination, calibration, and reclassification of a marker in predicting of coronary heart disease. And first, discrimination. CRP is not a good discriminator. As we can see here, in fact, the distribution for CRP in those that develop heart disease and those that do not develop, there's huge overlap. And regarding calibration and reclassification, they conclude that CRP does not perform better than the Framingham risk equation for discrimination, and the improvement is small and inconsistent. It is better, but it's not much better. What about genotype? Genetic testing there's a lot of talk about genetic testing in finding those at high risk, and it was dealt with in this perspective in New England Journal of Medicine earlier this year, where they discussed single nucleotide polymorphisms as predictors for coronary heart disease and other diseases. And it is stated that the great majority of the newly identified risk markers, alleles, confer very small relative risk ranging from 1.1 to 1.5. And even combined, they generally have low discriminatory and predictive ability. And what is very important, in fact, there's been a lot of study in this area now, many studies for genome-wide screening, and they collectively explain only a very small proportion of the underlying genetic contribution to most studies deceased. So in fact, there is more information in family history, because family history capture all these single nucleotide polymorphism genetic markers that individually only confer a very small additional risk. So it's very hard to beat just asking the question about family history of premature coronary artery disease. So individual risk factors are not good predictors for this disease. But what if we combine them and measure many risk factors? And which was in fact also assessed by Walt and Law in this paper in Lancet some years ago. They not only measured apolipoprotein and cholesterol level, they also measured systolic blood pressure, smoking, and family history. And after measuring all this, they concluded, in fact, it is not advisable to screen for ischemic heart disease by measuring any combination of cholesterol, ApoB, ApoA1, ApoA, and the other risk factors. And it was, in fact, the background for the suggestion of the polypill concept introduced in British Medical Journal in 2003. It was the fact, if you cannot find those that need treatment, treat all about a certain age without requiring risk factor to be measured. And this concept is also discussed very much today. So multiple risk factor is also poor as a screening tool. But you can combine all these multiple risk factors in an algorithm so that you can come out with a single score, a global score that should be easy to understand and easy to handle. You have this global risk score, the Framingham. You have this chart. You can go on, you have a web-based version for global risk assessment. You have the ATP guidelines, and you have a web-based version. You can go and calculate the global risk score. And in Europe, we also have a score for Northern Europe and Southern Europe because they are differently calibrated. So you can use this score. But how good do these scores perform in finding those that need treatment? Many of you have seen this paper before by ACOSA that evaluated the panel 3 guideline retrospectively in young adults that came with their first myocardial infarction and found that only 25% met criteria to qualify for pharmacotherapy in this retrospective review. Let's go to more prospective data. Can you predict? And how good, in fact, do Framingham predict in Framingham with the traditional risk factor score and with CRP added? It was in fact published last year in this paper. And here we have what is called the reclassification table. First you see how would you classify with the traditional Framingham risk score, and how would you reclassify if you add CRP. During follow-up, 110 events occur. During the traditional Framingham risk scoring, 60%, not 60%, only 16 events out of these 110 events occur in those classified as high risk. Adding CRP, 25 out of 110 events occur in those classified as high risk. It is more than 16, but nevertheless, even with the best available global score here, you misclassify more than 75% of all heart events to classifications as low risk or intermediate risk. And in women, it is even worse, reported here by Ritker, where he introduced the Reynolds risk score by adding CRP and family history to the traditional risk factor scoring. And here you have the reclassification table. It is very difficult to understand and comprehend because many of them are relative value. But I have tried to calculate the real numbers in this reclassification table, and we have it here. And then I think it's more easy to understand. We have first, to the left, we have the traditional risk factor scoring, and on top we have the traditional risk factor scoring with CRP and family history added, the Reynolds risk score. And during follow-up, there was 197 events among these females. 2 of these events occurred in females that were classified as high risk by the traditional risk factor scoring. 15 of these events were classified as high risk if you add CRP and family history. It is more, but still more than 90% of all coronary heart disease events was misclassified to low or intermediate risk women. Most of the events occurred, in fact, in those at very low risk by the traditional risk factors. 118 events occurred, and with the Reynolds risk score, 101 events occur. It's more than half of the events in this female occurred in those at very low risk. So these risk factors are not very good or useful to find women at high risk of having a heart attack. And they also conclude that neither new algorithm provided substantial information about women at very low risk, and it's most of the women. A few months ago, this paper was published in Circulation, the performance measure for primary prevention of cardiovascular disease in adults. And they also discussed the usefulness of global risk estimations. And they say here, these risk equations have face validity and provide excellent discrimination. I don't think I agree with these figures here, that they provide excellent discrimination. But it is in fact what is stated in this paper. And it's followed, nevertheless, that limited data indicate that the use of these risk equations improves outcome. So there is not what is considered, the study has not been done in a randomized way. What we are discussing here is observational data that indicate who is at risk, but there has not been any formal testing of the screening performance of these global risk assessments. But maybe it's not needed, but it has not been done. Nevertheless, they continue to recommend that global risk assessments are done, preferential by the Framingham risk scoring, otherwise with other risk estimators, the Adult Treatment Panel 3, Global Risk Estimate, European score, or the Reynolds risk score. So it is recommended to do global risk estimations. Is it evidence-based? Is it a double standard? I have this double standard from you, Howie, Heck. What I mean with double standard, it is now, it has not been tested, these global risk estimate. It's only observational data that indicate that you can classify people in low, intermediate, and high risk. But in fact, you also have a very fine global risk estimator in imaging, and it has been published in this paper on coronary calcification by CT as a measure of global cardiovascular risk, where they have shown how you can reclassify the intermediate group that is large, and where you give none of those in the intermediate risk are treated according to their real risk, but either they are high risk or they are low risk, but they are put in this category and are not treated appropriately. But by using coronary calcium score, you can reclassify 2/3 of those in the intermediate risk according to this paper. So coronary calcification is very good to classify people according to observational data. But what is also discussed, what is evidence and what is hard evidence? Do we need randomized trial to classify an intervention or a prediction method as high evidence? If we go back to the adult treatment panel 3 in primary prevention, we don't have many randomized trials in primary prevention, but we have a lot of evidence-based statements that are not based on randomized trial. For example, on diet, an androgen diet is a major modifiable risk factor for coronary heart disease, C1. There is very strong evidence for this statement, but it is based on observational study, but it's still valid. And the same is true for physical inactivity. It's a major modifiable risk factor for coronary heart disease based on very strong evidence, but not randomized trial. And the same is true for cigarette smoking. There is very strong independent evidence for smoking as an independent risk factor. It's not based on randomized trial, but nevertheless, the evidence is strong. So we don't always need a randomized trial to find out whether there is good evidence for what we are doing. Going back to this performance measures paper, where they recommend global risk estimations. Maybe it's easy to do, but it's not always easy to understand how you reach on this value. And if it's difficult to understand, then it is not used. And if, what's useful with a global risk estimator if no one is using it? And I will just here finally draw your attention to this editorial in Nature Review Cardiology that was published in August by Valentin Fuster. Of course you cannot read it, but I will read it for you. And I think there is very good thoughts in this editorial. In December last year, at the annual ACC Cardiovascular Symposium in New York, Valentin Fuster asked the audience of approximately 2,000 cardiologists and internists a simple question. For evaluation and management of risk factor, the scientific community and some of the guidelines refer to high, intermediate, or low risk scores. How many of you have the scoring tables or charts in your offices? The answer was astonishing and reassured me of my personal position. Only 11 out of 2,000. Out of the approximately 2,000 audience, remember, raised their hands. How many of you have this risk score in your offices? Okay, I think it's also 11. How many use them? More use them, okay, but it's not many. To have an impact on primary prevention, we should thus begin by simplifying our approach to the evaluation and management of risk factors. And what's going through this editorial, it needs to be simplistic. We need to be simple, and we need to simplifying approach. This approach, if it should be used, otherwise it's not used and it is useless. And what is said here in the middle, primary prevention strategies for individual patients should be simple and personal. And what is more simple to see a picture of your heart and see a picture of the disease we are talking about? It's easy to understand, both for the patient but also for the physician. And I think it's a very important aspect of what we are talking about. It's how to implement risk assessment so that it can benefit the patients. And here is the conceptual flow charts introduced by the SHAPE guidelines. And just to again state that risk factors are indeed important therapeutic targets, but their ability to predict are limited. So we suggest we should not start by measuring risk factor for risk prediction, because they are not good for that purpose. But we have some tool today where we can assess the disease in the vessel wall itself by differing imaging or other testing modalities. And then, of course, when you have assessed risk and find the right risk category, then we need the risk factor that are causal and treat the risk factor to lower the risk according to the patient's risk. Thank you.